John Helliwell, editor of the World Happiness Report, economist. If there is somebody that really knows something about the state of world happiness and what the World Happiness Report 2023 is uncovering, is you. So thank you so much for sharing this with so many people around the world that are really using the data and the insights from the World Happiness Report to advance the happiness agenda, the well-being agenda, and to bring this to as many people as possible. So thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you for all you do to spread the science of happiness to people who need to know about it.
Thank you so much. So why don't we go right into the report? So what have we learned over this year? What are the highlights of this World Happiness Report 2023?
Well, we've looked back a little bit over the preceding decade because this is now the 11th report. But this year, of course, our three ranking years are 20, 21, and 22. So they're the 3 years of COVID. So we're then comparing these 3 years to the three pre-COVID years. And we're finding a continuation of what we started to see last year, of remarkable resiliency in the overall life evaluations. And so this year we've found that carrying on. And so in a way, we've then said, is it true also about the distribution of happiness? Because inequality under COVID has become a very important issue. We find, roughly speaking, that the pre-COVID inequalities have remained roughly constant. Across the population groups, we can measure the unemployed, the sick, the old, the females, males, old and young. And in part, that puts it back on us because we're finding the gaps between the happiest half of the population and the least happy half. That's the magnifying glass we're using to look at inequality this year. And those gaps can differ a lot between countries, from 1 or 2 points up to 5 or 6 points between the happy half and the less happy half. And we find in general that countries like to live, people like to live in countries where that happiness gap is smaller. They would prefer that everyone were happy. So that's the inequality, which just roughly remains stable. There have been some parts of the world where it's risen, but in general, fairly stable. We then go back and look at what was a surprising element last year of a big increase in 2021, especially in several measures of pro-sociality. We had generosity and volunteering, but especially the helping of strangers, which of course you could do in a way in COVID, in a way that classic volunteering and donations were being more limited. And we found that it was way up in 2021. And of course, we were then curious to see, as economies started and people started rejoining their other lives, whether that would carry on. And indeed it has, slightly less. But we're still finding that the helping of strangers, for example, right across the world, and this is in every region, is about a quarter higher than it was pre-pandemic. And so if you're thinking of people reorienting their lives, rethinking their purpose and what they should be doing, to have this outward-looking, other helping focus is a nice piece of light in the midst of crises. We focus this year on maintaining well-being in times of crisis because, of course, COVID is not the only crisis. We've got environmental crises and Ukraine and other places in the world where there's warfare rather than peace. And we look at COVID itself in terms of how countries with high trust levels were able to keep the death toll lower And for the first 2 years, and that gain hasn't been lost, the countries that tried to keep COVID out of community transmission were the ones that had many fewer deaths. Now, more or less, everybody's in the same boat under Omicron and got essentially the same policy approaches and roughly similar death rates. So COVID is by no means over, but it's remains the case that countries with high trust levels are able to keep healthier even under Omicron than the rest of the countries. Then we looked at how well-being and benevolence and trust in governments fared in Russia and Ukraine, starting back in essentially 2012, right through 2022. And we followed what sometimes people think that you can't get big changes in well-being if COVID doesn't create a big drop in life evaluations, which is the measure we use. What will? We show that after 2014, there was an increase in life evaluations in Russia and a drop in Ukraine. And that gap grew to about 2 points on the 10-point scale. So that's a huge gap between the two. They gradually converged towards the end of the decade and were essentially equal in 2021 after the Zelensky election boost. And then in 2022, they went up in Russia and down in Ukraine. The trust in government in both countries rose. As this is one of the things, unfortunately, that although trust is very good for well-being, it can be sometimes trust that's at the expense of peace and the expense of the well-being of others. And that really means that people like you who are trying to bring peacemaking together with happiness making, I have to focus on the essential nature of the creating social identities that span many religions and span national borders. So you don't make common purpose at someone else's expense. You make common purpose in a broader interest. Now, you can see why that's, of course, necessary for global warming, but of course, it's even more necessary for peace. Although it's possible to generate more faith in your own government by going to war on somebody else, that's not got a broader purpose, of course. So we did find in 2022, confidence in government in both countries rose significantly in their own government, more so in Ukraine than in Russia. And there are also measures in Ukraine of confidence or support for Russian policy, which had been low after 2014, and then went right to zero in 2022 in all parts of Ukraine. Benevolence, interestingly enough, both countries became more benevolent during 2021, right up there with rates increases as high as anywhere in the world. In 2022, you had a still further increase in the helping of strangers and donations in Ukraine, but falling off significantly in Russia. So there, two countries are in both cases. Benevolence and common purpose are important in sustaining well-being. That doesn't solve the problem, obviously. So what's needed to create peace is what we as data collectors cannot provide. Then finally, as a fourth point, having used that to explain that crises themselves can bring forth a sense of common purpose, which itself is enabling you to do more, and you hope what's the more of is more and a good common purpose. The final special topic we dealt with in chapter 2, we ought to come back and talk about what's in the other chapters of the report also, if we get a chance, is some new data on social connections. So Gallup and Meta together did a deep dive into 7 large countries spanning 6 global regions. So it's not just in the Western countries at all, and it includes Brazil and Egypt, France, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and the United States. And in all of those countries, even in 2022, which was still scarred by COVID and other things, the prevalence of feelings of positive social support was twice as great as feelings of loneliness. And in all those countries in general, not only was that prevalence higher, the importance was higher, so that it mattered more to people to have social support than to be free of loneliness. Back to you.
Thank you so much, John. Super interesting. So basically, I think that you tap into at least 4 big issues and insights. Something that we are focusing on during this week, Happiness Week, is about new stories, new narratives, how we can create new narratives to rise in, so we can get into a state of fundamental peace. And you tap into that, and you tap into the good common purpose. So from what I'm learning here is, actually, it might not be a good common purpose. It could be basically a purpose where people can rally together as defending your own space, your own territory, your own country, your own family. That creates the purpose. So if global leaders understand that this common purpose is something that we need in order to increase overall well-being, I think that this is a very big story to tell. But now it depends what is going to be the purpose. The purpose is going to be harming somebody. The purpose is going to be building and constructing and getting into a state of peace. Do you feel that there is a difference between having a purpose that has a positive intention with a purpose that actually doesn't have a positive intention? Do we have data for that?
Well, I think you're asking, do you get more happiness when your common purpose is for the benefit of others, exactly, as opposed to potentially damaging others? Yes. There are obviously some examples of that. One of the things we have a special chapter on this year is what are the causes of pro-social behavior and what are the consequences of them? And so this is people acting altruistically against or ignoring their own personal interests in order to help other people. And the evidence is really quite strong that there are positive feedbacks there. And so that all of that suggests that to the extent you create common purpose that damages other people, it's less likely to have a long run positive impact, even on your own well-being. And of course, it's damaging for the well-being of others. For national leaders and community leaders, I think it's important to say, and we do this in chapter 1, we've got a chapter 1 focused on what is the whole purpose of the well-being movement. And we take it right back to Aristotelian frameworks, where we're saying really it's virtue. And virtue obviously rules out the achievement of short-term goals that help you and her at the expense of other people, because the whole purpose of well-being, and we capture it to some extent in showing that people are happier when they are being more benevolent, but it still remains a temptation for political leaders, especially, if their support is slipping or something's going wrong, if you can find an external threat that you can try and bring people together to fight a devil outside the gates, it's tempting. But from the broader movement looking for broader world happiness and peace, that clearly is a false signal. And so the lesson you have to offer to leaders is don't take that superficially attractive, easy route of building common purpose at the extent of others, whether they be in different races, different ages, different income levels, different parts of the country, or different countries. Don't do it, because in the long run, you will find that even your own well-being is higher if you really feel that you have created good for people, not at the expense of other people. To do that in the long run, we as educators and as thinking of the sources of chapter 1, the philosophers of the world, have to create for people a sense of broader social identity. So who are we? So you start then thinking it for we, it's who are we interested in? The answer is it's not just people in my town or my country or my age or my generation. We're thinking of the world in the future, and we're thinking of the whole world in the future. Well, those are much broader social identities than used to permit evolution of social animals as we are, where it was protection and building on a very small scale. So you didn't need the broader social identities. Now the world is so interconnected that the social identities have to be broadened to be equally wide to the scope of where our actions are felt. And I think everyone understands that those really broad identities are not easy to establish. In the whole trust literature, there's lots of evidence that it's natural and easy to trust and cooperate with someone with whom you have direct social connections. That's why one of the reasons why social connections are so important for happiness. They're also so very important for peace and for cooperation. And it's part of the human condition that when we can see people and talk to them and meet with them, we're much more likely to trust them. We're much more likely to understand their motivations, and we're much less likely to think ill of them or to do anything that deliberately either ignores or flouts their interests. So that's a big agenda.
It's a big agenda. I feel, but the insight that you are sharing is very, very important, actually, to create the macro change that we need, as well as we work at the micro level. You know that we run this program at the United Nations University for Peace. We call it Gross Global Happiness, and we always bring all these change makers from around the world. Just the first minute that all these people get together, we stop talking about countries. Nobody talks, you don't even know where people are coming from. We are focused on issues, and the issues go from education to inequality to equanimity, to bringing techniques of social-emotional learning to the classroom. But it's very interesting how you build community through topics and not through national identities. However, when we watch the news, it's all about like China, United States, Germany. It's like those are the entities that represent us as humanity. And the feeling I have is that people don't want that any longer. People want to have a broader identity, but it's not easy to build that identity. You mentioned one thing, which is trust and benevolence. I feel that those values, as well as happiness as a virtue, and actually Ed Diener was one of the psychologists that really spoke about happiness as a virtue in an amazing way. I think those can be ingredients: virtue, benevolence, trust, of a broader identity. Can we go deeper into those elements? And I think they are covered on chapter 2. Can we go deeper into benevolence and trust and how these could become major drivers for world happiness?
Well, I think you mentioned that the very moment you brought these people together into your Changemakers course, you found that they stopped thinking of themselves as being from a particular country. They were focused on building trust. But the important thing from the perspective of the research I know is that you are bringing them together. It's much easier to build trust in a situation where you're together looking at something else rather than negotiating something between yourselves. So, but more importantly, everyone who goes to those courses of yours, they will never again think the same way about people who come from the societies that the other people came from. That wasn't their objective in coming, perhaps, but it's almost surely going to be one of the important things for them to take away. And so I think it is important for leaders, whether it's in communities or whether you're thinking across countries, that they learn how much is in common in the human condition, and that they understand the importance of looking broadly in order to understand the other person's perspective, because that automatically, of course, through your greater connections with them and knowledge of them, makes you more likely to cooperate with them, makes you more likely to want peace rather than something at their expense. But it also makes you feel better. There's quite a lot of evidence on benevolence, the experimental sort, that people are always happier when they're doing things for other people. But the more it's genuine benevolence and not something because you're expecting something back later on, or being paid to do it, it's when it's actually coming from the heart where the gains are biggest. And so once you construct this broader social identity through direct contact, because the direct contacts build trust, it also means that you've broadened the field for benevolence, and you've probably made the benevolence better, because a lot of benevolent acts are based on what I think will improve the life of those people. Well, one thing we've learned about benevolence and trust is it's really important that the person you're trying to help or the group you're trying to help, in fact, is an agent of change themselves. And what's being done is something that's driven from within and below in that society. And so if we're coming from outside to want to be benevolent, the best way is to be their assistant and not their boss. In other words, this is not top-down aid coming from planes. It's, in fact, cooperation. And that's what's the beauty of courses of the sort you run, is that you bring people together who themselves are going to be designing the change in the societies in which they live. And what they're then sharing with others is a lesson that there's a great commonality in all of this. And human beings are essentially similar everywhere. And that there is a wellspring of benevolence to be tapped. Now, if you follow the media, and I think you mentioned that when people come out of your classes and turn on the news, it tends to be about nations, but worse than that, it tends to be about bad things happening generally. Yes. It's part of the purpose of the World Happiness Report. Is to try and right that information balance, not to create a false image of positivity, but to say, well, let's actually look at what people think, how they feel, and what they do. And as you remember, I think we've talked in previous years about the wallet experiments, and that evidence remains very strong that people, by and large, feel better when they're in a trustworthy environment, but they are falsely pessimistic about the trustworthiness of the environments they live in. Well, building social connections at all levels is one way of getting around that. Obviously, the more you know the people on the streets, as it were, the less likely you are to regard them as a threat, the more likely as a friend.
What can we learn then from, and you mentioned a bit that you went through the crisis of Russia and Ukraine as well as COVID. What can we learn? Because, I mean, I feel that we're in a constant alert and a constant crisis around the world these days. It's like, if it's not one thing happening in your neighbor, it's something happening miles away, but it looks like it happens, it is happening to you. And I think this is because of the the whole social networks and the whole time where we are not even 3 steps of separation from somebody else. Before Facebook, we were saying that we were just 6 levels of separation from somebody else. Now it's probably less than 3. So I think the feeling of hyperconnection is huge. And with that, the feeling of living everybody's crisis is true as well. So I think that we are getting into a state of constant alert. And from a psychological point of view, we know that when you are in a state of constant alert, we react in a very different way than when we are in a state of harmony and balance. So what can we learn from Russian and Ukraine crisis and the impact that's happening, that's having, not just for Ukrainians and Russians, but for the world, as well as what happened with COVID? Do we have some key insights where we can start building the future with a new narrative?
Well, I think the import of what you're saying is that you want to focus on things that you yourself can do to make life better for other people. And that doesn't mean an over-concentration on the news feed, whether it's coming from the social media or elsewhere. It means paying more attention to the environment immediately around you and what you can do to make it a better one. And that typically involves good surprises as well as much more than bad ones. That's the whole point of encouraging people to reach out and connect with other people. They'll find that the people they connect with are not like the people they're reading about in the media. They're in fact benevolent and people they would like to cooperate with. So keeping these real social connections in the neighborhood, on the workplace, in the healthcare system, in schools, and teaching the skills to connect with other people in a more positive and engaging ways, it not only produces benefits directly, but it de-escalates the pressures towards constant alert that you're talking about. Because your mind, especially the fast part of the brain, keeps starting at snakes long after snakes are likely to be a source of real danger. And we don't want to start those reactions working in the wrong way. And going through past crises, people have often talked about bystander effects and looting after earthquakes and so on. If you go deep into the study of these things, you find that especially in places where trust and social capital are higher, in the wake of an earthquake, people they rush in instinctively, often at the cost of their own safety, to help others without any thought to themselves. That doesn't get in the news very much, but it's an important lesson to be learned from crises. And it's true of all the crises that people are continually surprised about the extent to which people will worsen their own interests in order to help other people. And that's the positive lesson out of crises and responses to them. We just have to make sure that we get the basic framework less dangerous than it has to be. In other words, you really don't want to create a crisis just to show that we can connect with one another. We ought to get the benefits from connection and avoid the next crisis.
Yeah, but it's so interesting. I just landed in Spain after Costa Rica, and on the plane, 30 minutes into the flight, the flight attendant basically get the microphone and ask, is there a doctor on board? Because we have a passenger struggling. Well, the plane was completely silent. Nobody wants to talk to each other. At some point, it's like you are with yourself. There are really few conversations. The moment that she asked about the doctor, everybody connected.
That's interesting.
And suddenly, 10 doctors stand up and they ran to the galley of the plane. And that was so interesting because suddenly people started connecting to each other because of this person that was going through an issue. And suddenly all these anonymous people became doctors. I mean, they were doctors already, but they raised their hand.
Yeah.
There was no doctor on the plane who didn't raise their hand.
Yeah.
And they ran. Actually, one of them was sitting close to me, and it wasn't just a millisecond. She said, "I have to go." So I think this is really building on what you are saying. Of course, that's not news, but we all witnessed how people got together immediately and how people became responsible. So this is a big word, responsibility, is the ability to respond. And we forget the responsibility is the ability to respond, and we have that ability. Can we find more evidence as part of the World Happiness Report that builds on the responsibility that we all have in order to respond to issues, and especially when we talk about social connections and trust and benevolence going forward?
Well, we've looked at crises before. In one of the earlier reports, we looked at what the 2007-8 financial crisis did to well-being. And we found there was an interaction between how it affected people's subjective well-being, their life evaluations, and how they and their governments had responded. So in the higher trust areas, by and large, people just got on with responding and had overall consequences that were much better. So another way of putting it is, it shows that the payoff to having these kind of deeper social connections with your neighbors and the people you run into produce benefits, not just all the time, but especially in times of crisis, because it then means immediately you put up your hand and help the person in trouble. And you not only do it yourself, but you're confident that other people will be doing it as well. And that's very important because, of course, there's great power in a shared response to something that needs doing. But in order for that to happen, you have to have confidence in the other people you're dealing with. And that also includes confidence in your neighbors, and it includes confidence in your public institutions, that they're going to, if they give you advice, it's going to be good advice. If they're going to be doing their own bit to help provide a framework in which the responses are sensible.
Something that I'm very curious is, as well as everything that we are talking about, is around the gaps between the happiest and the unhappiest, and the concept of equality and even equanimity in the world happiness space. What do you have to say about equality of happiest and unhappiest people?
Well, we continued to find with our new evidence this year that people like to live in a society with more equality. Once you get on the ethical side of the discussion about happiness, there's sometimes a debate between people who say we should consider that everyone's happiness, and those who said, no, we want to focus on reducing the misery, where there is misery. And my general reaction to that is we don't want to compartmentalize and stigmatize people who are in trouble, whether it's mental illness or unemployment or being subject to discrimination or illness or disfigurement, you name it. We want to treat everybody as being worthy of a better life. But in fact, when you then actually do what the experts say you should do, in other words, look at all the policies in terms of what they'll do to improve happiness, the biggest total happiness gains from a new policy is when they're actually raising the people who are most in trouble out of their misery. because of course they're going to give the biggest gains for any. So when you're thinking about which communities do you want to help organize themselves to build something better, well, you often go to the ones that are not the easiest ones to work with, but are the ones that have most to gain, because of course that will at once deal with misery, but it will be the most effective way of increasing general happiness. So you don't have to sort of break people and say, we're only looking at your happiness because you're mentally ill. Say, no, we want a system, in other words, where we don't wait till you're lonely and then give you a pill. We want to vaccinate you against loneliness by essentially providing a social environment in which everyone is accepted and everyone is welcome. There's one result we had that speaks to that, where we saw that people who were discriminated against, who were sick, who were unemployed, were all who felt the streets were unsafe at night. They were all less happy than other people. But if they were living in what they thought of was a trustworthy environment, the damage to their happiness from these negative circumstances was much reduced. And so then by building this trustworthy environment, you are in fact producing the biggest gains to those who are in the worst positions. And that's, of course, our objective in ethical terms and in practical terms.
Yeah, this is so beautiful.
In that sense, in that sort of broad framework of policy making, you actually do bring the worst off up towards the rest. And as I mentioned at the beginning, people like that. They like living in a society where there is not a big gap between the happy and the less happy.
Wow, we have a lot of work to do in this regard, because something that we are witnessing, it's, at least from a perceptual point of view, polarization, and more polarization in so many ways. So I think that for some reason, I love being in this space and this movement that we've been creating now for years, because we really need to give another perspective, because otherwise we only feel the polarization perspective, and we don't see the anonymous people raising their hand on the plane willing to help. John, I was just a few weeks ago invited to the U.S. Conference of Mayors in Washington, and I had the opportunity to present on a Cities of Happiness framework. There were hundreds and hundreds of mayors, but something that it was common to all those mayors was the perception that they are going through a humanitarian crisis when they got to mental health issues. That just in Los Angeles, there are more than 50,000 people living on the streets because they cannot afford housing, or because they got into this trap of drugs, and then of course mental health issues with depression and feeling excluded. So the feeling of being excluded from things is so powerful that people cannot go over it. So I think some cities in the United States, and many, they were talking about humanitarian crisis. But at the same time, we know that if we are able to build those common spaces that trust building our happiness as a virtue and our benevolence, we can solve the issue. But it looks like we are basically trapped into going over this. Do you have a recommendation how to go and get out of the trap?
Well, it typically involves operations right at the bottom. There are some experiments in Regina, in the first instance in Canada, where they were having each social service and public service, whether it was the police or the emergency responders, or they were all rushing from crisis to crisis of somebody on the streets or whatever. And then they said, this is not good enough. So they brought all the people together, including, and especially important, including the people living in those troubled communities, and saying, how can we organize this so the right kind of supports are there to allow you to build better lives for yourselves. And it involves that we call joining the silos. And it's difficult because people want to do their own thing and they've got their own restrictions. So just like, and we've talked about this before, the great advantages of mixing the very young and the very old by having school classes taught in elder care facilities and so on. The same kind of thing you want to have happening in central city areas. You want to essentially try and construct a purpose-built movement to a better life. But it's not easy because we're finding in a lot of these cities that they become magnets for troubled cases. And so you've then got not just a typical set of the population, and so you've got to, it's complicated. And each city is handling it in its own way. But I think what you've emphasized is there's a lot of commonality. But I think the message you took to them, I think I can guess the nature of that message, is exactly what they need to hear. That they should be thinking about the happiness of all. And to do that, you have to unleash people's possibilities for helping each other create better lives. And it obviously means better facilities and places to live for people in trouble. We've tended to sort of emphasizing human rights not to be restrained, taken people and essentially put them on the streets who should never have been on the streets. They should have been in a family, in a home, somewhere that they were a practicing positive member of the community, even given their own difficulties they brought into it. And you can't just give people prescriptions and put them on the streets. That's what your mayors, I'm sure, were saying.
Yes. We know that it's complex, but I think that we all here are giving a common message is focus on the intention. And if the intention is happiness, focus on happiness. Because everybody wants happiness for everybody at some point. So focus on that. But it's so easy to get distracted because you set that as the goal, but in the meantime and in the middle, you have to do so many things that distract you from the ultimate goal that then you get trapped into the process of getting into the goal.
That's true. And the thing that people don't pay enough attention to is how much happiness is created or destroyed by the process itself.
Exactly.
So you don't think about what the program is, you think how it's designed and how it's delivered. And the mere fact that people are intrinsically empowered and involved in thinking about and producing these help for others is itself it'll not only be better informed and give you a better policy, it will be more effective right from the outset. And people have not understood that, the happiness power of being engaged productively and proactively and cooperatively in improving these problems. So it changes the way you think of the problem, and it certainly changes the way you think of how you should address it. So it's happiness in that process of fixing that's as important as the final goal that you're aiming at.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Okay, so I have one last question, because you've been working on this report for 11 years. This is 11th, well, for longer into the space, of course. But we have this report now for 11 years. Is there something new, something that you said, that you look at the report and say, wow, I never realized this? Or aha moment, something that you want to share with us that actually, where you actually pay attention in a different way? Is there something that it's especially interesting for you?
Well, the continuing, and I hope it's continuing into the longer future, power of benevolence was a surprise that it continued as strongly as it did, to have reaffirmation of the power of common cause and a sense of togetherness was not new. But it's reaffirmed in a broader range of situations. It's humbling in a way to present a World Happiness Report and focus, as we do, on what seems to some people as, why are you doing this in these awful times? And you have to keep remembering that the world is a better place than people think it is. And that's one of the things about crises, is they change people's worldview as well as putting pressures on them to fix it. So you must recognize the pressures and what needs to be done, but don't let it give you a pessimistic worldview about the nature of people. That's a project in progress. And the purpose of this report is to focus on the ways of getting there in a more peaceful and clearly happier way than by focusing on just the mechanics of producing things.
Wow. Well, thank you, John. As always, we always talk about hope for things. If there is hope for world happiness, it's definitely you. and hope for peace is a combination of that happiness and that peace that we all want. So thank you again. Thank you so much for doing everything that you do to keep this project moving. And here we are to support anyhow to get the message and the data and the programs out to as many people as possible. So thank you so much.
Well, it only gets value when it gets into the hands of people like you, who are actually delivering the insights to the people who need to change and want to change the way they live their lives and do their leadership. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. And happy International Day of Happiness.
Indeed.